Native tribes as well as Caddo ancestral lands, and so I just wanted to acknowledge that. Before I start, and I'm sure that you all know where you're situated out here in this Dallas area, but to acknowledge that there are Caddo, Wichita, Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, and other tribes who have been connected to this land, and then of course you all who are here, and that there are multiple tribes that are from this area. So I just want to make sure to acknowledge that. One of the things that I want to acknowledge is that I have been informed in my praxis of how I lead, how I research, and who I am as an Indigenous person is through the tribal communities that I've been connected to, as well as my own tribal community as well. But one of the things that I learned when I was in the Pacific Northwest, I just recently moved back from Washington State in the Tacoma area. And one of the things with Coast Salish tribes is that they open the circle when we are starting a ceremony, starting a week. There's protocols. And so one of the things that I wanted to acknowledge is that we are opening the circle with this talk as well as with this conference. And hopefully you'll build connections today, right? And so one of the things that if I had sound, I would have showed you this meditation video, but I can also send it to Veronica to maybe share out. One of the reasons that I share that is that many of our tribes have been impacted by the loss of land, loss of culture, and the Muckleshoot tribe bought back 97,000 acres of their land in the Auburn area, Enumclaw area in Washington. And during the pandemic, as many of you all were impacted potentially, is that we had loss of connection to our elders and to our land for various reasons. And so Elise Bill Garish created a video where she incorporated their Muckleshoot language as well as connecting it to the Tamanous forest, the land. So one of the things I want, and so you can view that later on. If you just put Muckleshoot meditation in YouTube, you can bring it right up. But one of the things I wanted to ask is, what is something you are bringing with you today? So that can be something that you're bringing with you, whether it's a situation at home, in your community. It could be your ancestors. It could be something that you're wanting to learn or build connections around. And then why are you passionate about connecting with Native youth and tribal communities? So today is about building connections, and it's an opportunity for you all to be able to reestablish connections, to build new connections, and to really think about that passion area. Why are we connected and passionate as Indigenous people to be connected to our communities and to our family? One of the other things that I would like us to think about are creation stories, to think about our own tribal creation stories. How many of us are aware of our own tribal creation story and how that started and how that connects to the human and non-human, and thinking about what that looks like for us, but then also taking it to an individual level is, what is your creation story? And how do you talked about that or articulated that to be able to start thinking about how that intertwines? And why is that important? It's important because we have future generations of children, nieces and nephews who are going to be asking us these questions, right? Who are going to want to know this. And then where does community and relationality show up in our creation stories, whether that's the individual creation stories or tribal creation stories? So for me, I'm Kiowa. We came up out of a log and we were ants in this before life, right? And we came up out of the log and we became human. And so, as you all know about ants, they're very communal, right? They work together to do something big. And so thinking about that relationality aspect and how we're connected as people. And so one of the other things, so I'm going to talk through these outer pieces. In 2015, I co-edited a book on Indigenous leadership in higher education, where we had 21 Indigenous leaders in higher education, from tribal colleges to organizations to higher education institutions. And then we also had Native student leaders also sharing their stories about their journeys into leadership and their connections. And what came from those stories, 21 stories, is this inner circle, looking at who we are, right? So what came out of all of their stories is like, who we are as Indigenous people is important, and acknowledging that. And then what we strive to embody is important. So acknowledging what we strive to embody as Indigenous people is important. What is known, so for some of that is epistemologies, right? Or Indigenous epistemology and how that's connected. And then what we do as Indigenous people is important. So how we build transformation within our communities. And so I'll go over these other pieces here in a minute. Honoring our ancestors is one of the concepts that we're out. And so over the years, so it's been about 10 years since I've done that book. And so one of the things that come out of my work with tribal communities, my work with my scholarship, is all of these different voices, right? And all my life experiences, honoring our ancestors. So thinking about their journey and how we can embed that in our understanding and our values and who we are and our legacy. So the practice of honoring our ancestors comes in how we tell their stories and how we understand their stories. Because if it wasn't for their resistance or resilience, many of us wouldn't be here today, right? And so I share this picture of Ollicott, who some of you may be familiar with Chief Joseph, because it's like a story that people actually is in history books. But this is Ollicott, his brother, who was my great-great-grandfather, because earlier I said I was Nez Perce. And so when they were being forced to be put on a reservation, there was a battle of Bear Paw, Montana. And one of the things that happened is he was fighting against the U.S. military to be put on a reservation. And at the time that was happening, he had one child, Sarah, who was 2 years old, and he was killed at the Battle of Bear Paw. And if he wouldn't have had a daughter at that time, I wouldn't be here today. And so thinking about those stories of where we almost weren't here, we almost weren't present. And today I think is really important, because when we talk about our youth, we talk about our families, that helps us to understand the power and the connections that we have to our stories. So I had an activity, I don't think we have too much time, but I do want you to think about this, is naming an ancestor in your family or tribal community, if you're able to, because I know for some people, when after they pass, you're not able to say their name. So I want to acknowledge that. And what stories have you heard about that ancestor? And then in what ways have they displayed resilience and strength? And then how can you carry that with you today? So if you have a chance later on today, or if you feel reflective at some point, to think about an ancestor, and it doesn't have to be like a distant ancestor, it could be your grandmother, it could be your grandfather, right? And what are the stories you've heard about them? And then how do they carry resilience and strength with them? And how can you take that with you today? Being a good relative, I'm sure is something that we all have heard. So for many of us, we strive to do this by what we witnessed from our grandparents and our parents. And so how do we bring relationality into our hard work? And I use hard work as a way of thinking about something that we are passionate about, whether it's in like our strengths and our gifts, that we give that to others. We just are passionate by our communities and the purpose. And so how do we honor the notion of being a good relative? And what does that mean to us when we are mentoring and bringing people together in a good way? So here's a picture over here of my daughter and my niece. And this was during the pandemic. So for those of you who may not know, but in Washington was the first state where COVID was documented in the United States, in Washington State. And so I lived in Federal Way, which is close to Tacoma. It was like a part of Seattle area. And we actually were in lockdown for 2 years because we were not being around other people because of the pandemic and the different strains that were happening. And so during that time, I was able to be a part of starting a tribal-based doctoral cohort. And so one of the things that I do is I have cedar from Oklahoma, from the Wichita Mountains, and I had my mom mail me some cedar, and I wanted to gift this to the doctoral students. And so one of the things I had my niece and my daughter do was to help me break up the cedar, and then we put them in medicine bundles, and then we mailed those to the students. And so for me, this is a way for me to show them how to be a good relative, right, is by doing something for others, but to also do it in a good way. And so thinking about how we can do that and be intentional and being a good relatives. Because I think one of the other things that I would say is when we embed that praxis in all parts of our lives, it helps to shift how people think about things, right? So even in me working at the university, when my daughter was born in New Mexico, because we were in New Mexico for 7 years, in Albuquerque area, one of the things that I did is I called all of my daughters, like my colleagues that were white, I called them her aunties, so that they would take care of her and they would think about her as a relative, because I think that changes and shifts how we do things. If we think about we're doing this as a relational way, we're doing this in a way that's intentional, so my daughter has a lot of aunties all over the place, right, and uncles. And so thinking about how that shifts for them to take care of her, but to also think about the future generations that they're also impacting in their work. So telling our stories is important. It humanizes us, it brings connections to others that are important to who we are as Indigenous people. Sharing our stories and our identities and life experiences. There's so many people here that have so many lived experiences, life experiences that are important. I do share with who I am. So this is actually a picture of me at my high school graduation. And I share this because at this time I was like, oh, I'm accepted to the University of Oklahoma, which is where I work now. But when I started out my freshman year, I actually was not in an urban area when I went to high school. I was in Elgin, which is a rural school, in the Lawton area. And so I graduated with 88 people in my high school class. But then going to a campus with 20,000 students can be shocking, right? And can be a way of like, what do I do? And so one of the things that happened when I was a freshman in college is I was on academic probation. And I know many of us have maybe had those journeys in education. So deciding on whether or not to continue forward in my education or to stop out or drop out. And I decided to continue forward after I did an internship in the summer after my freshman year on the White Earth Reservation. And I was able to find the resources and ask for help. So I think that's one of the things that we think about. And at the time I was only 18, right? And so thinking about asking for help, but also then thinking about how can I help others coming behind me not have that same experience. And so as a part of that, I also became a co-founder of a Native American sorority, Gamma Delta Pi, and then also started a Native peer mentoring program at the University of Oklahoma. And then I share this, so now I have a doctoral degree. So even though I was on academic probation with a 1.97 GPA, now I have a doctoral degree, I have 2 master's degrees. And one of the things that I would say, even in that journey to the end, and I shared this story with my doctoral students the other day, that even at the end of our journeys in education or in our pathways into our profession or careers, is that it's not always easy, and that's why we need to tell our students or the youth that we work with or are connected to our stories, because they need to hear the struggles that we've had. They need to know that it wasn't perfect. So just the other day was my doctorversary, so I became a doctor 12 years ago. And during that time, and actually Veronica is how I know her, because she was a student at Oklahoma State University where I used to work at. And that's where I also received my doctoral degree. But actually about 2 weeks before I defended my dissertation, my grandmother, who was my best friend, was in the hospital, and I had my dissertation defense. So for those of you who may not be familiar with a doctoral degree, you have to defend your dissertation, which is your research, and you present it, and then your committee decides if you get to become a doctor or not, basically. And so my grandmother was in the hospital for a week, so I was with her for over a week in the hospital. All of my family was, and I actually created my presentation in the hospital room while I was sitting there by her. And I also wrote my dissertation sitting in my grandmother's living room when I would go home on the weekends once a month to be with her. And my grandmother told me in my early 2000s, she told me to go all the way in education, and so this is my way of honoring her and doing that. And she ended up passing away on Easter Sunday, which was about 3 days before my dissertation defense. And so I asked my aunts and my uncles, like, what do I do? Like, should I reschedule my dissertation defense, or should I keep it? So anyways, they ended up having a later in the afternoon funeral so that I could go the night after her wake service and drive to Stillwater, which is about 2 hours away. And that morning I defended my dissertation and I became Dr. Robin Williams at the time, now Minthorn. And so the day of my grandmother's funeral, I became a doctor. And so, but I share that with my students and with people because I want them to know that it's not always easy. And so I was able to become the first doctor on both sides of my family. And I want them to know that they're gonna have struggles, they're gonna have hard times, but that they can make it through. And that's why we need to tell our stories. Like, what are your ways that you have persevered and how can you share that with other people so you can help inspire them and help them move through. So the next area is finding our medicine. How do we understand what our medicine is and where does it come from? And what are the essential questions we need to ask ourselves as we navigate our life's journey? So when I think about medicine and bringing those connections to who we are as Indigenous people, it also means connecting it in an intangible way. So my grandmother is my medicine, who my daughter is also named after. And this is the picture of my grandmother, her last name, me, my mom, and my grandma. And I actually have an exercise that we again won't be able to do, but I have some cedar in the back for you all. It's not a lot, I wanted to do more. But I have some cedar in the back and some little bags. So I have a cedar bag I carry with me in my backpack or wherever I'm going when I travel, or even when I'm going to work, because it reminds me who I am, who I'm connected to, and who I'm responsible to. And so one of the things I want to acknowledge, Americans for Indian Opportunity, LaDonna Harris, who's Comanche, who actually created this exercise, but I got permission to utilize it from her, is thinking about our medicine is our inner strength. It's something that's connected to the foundation of our cultural identity and helps us carry out our work and care for our families and to also heal ourselves. And so these are some questions that you can consider. And I have some copies of my presentation in the back too, so if you want to go back and look at these and maybe go through them, you're welcome to. Where do you get your medicine? What is your medicine? Who in your life has deeply influenced you? What life experiences have shaped your choices, values, and character? What reinforcing success messages did you get as a young person and from who? And for some of us, we didn't, right? And just acknowledging that. But maybe there was one person who did give us that, right? Whether it was a teacher, a counselor, an auntie, a grandma. For me, it was my grandmother. What values did your family or community hand down to you? And so for me, when I was starting as a faculty member at the University of New Mexico, I identified my 3 values that were connected to who I am as a Kiowa person. And so those values have grounded me in my role as a faculty member, and I've utilized that through the last 12 years as faculty because it helps me remember that I can't fall outside of those values, and if I do, that's my way of like reestablishing my connections. And so thinking about that for you maybe will be helpful if you haven't had the chance to do that. But I also think it gives us a powerful way of like continuing forward and navigating our journeys. And so acknowledging our connections is the next one. So acknowledging and honoring that we have opportunities to remember we are all intricately connected. We're connected to our ancestors, connected to our communities, connected to the non-human, and connected to our families. And so when I do get to speak with youth, I ask them who their family is, like who are your grandparents, who are your great-grandparents, who are your ancestors. And so even on a reservation, like I did this at my dad's reservation on the Umatilla reservation, and who their great-grandparents were, right? And even some of their grandparents, because we haven't been teaching our children that, right? And so thinking about how do we make sure we're bringing those connections, because those are important for our youth to know who their ancestors are, for you to know who your ancestors are, and to remember we're all connected. And as you all are Native or you're connected to Native people, you could talk to somebody for 5 minutes and you know somebody somehow, right? You have connections, and thinking about what that looks like for us. And so this is just a picture. Whenever I was at the University of New Mexico, I worked at the Kiva Club as their advisor. And during the No DAPL movement, we created a Water is Life event where we brought in some speakers and performers to bring awareness about water is life. And so I just wanted to share that picture with you. And the last area that I'm connecting to is leaving a legacy. Leaving a legacy and thinking about what we're doing today and what are we leaving for future generations, right? So today is about that, right? Creating those opportunities. And that could be, I know you're having like a future homeowners presentation, some other things, like that's part of it too, right? So like I'm the first homeowner in my family, like through my mom and dad and others, because we weren't taught how to do those things, right? And how to navigate that process. And thinking about how we live today and what we're doing and being intentional and being value filled, right? So again, to me, it's modeling my grandparents, thinking about finding our gifts to help us to cultivate ways to leave a legacy. And so this is a picture, I mentioned I just came from the University of Washington or Tacoma area, and I was a part of creating a tribal university partnership with the Muckleshoot tribe. And we started an indigenous-based, tribal-based doctoral cohort. And so this is 10 of our graduates in our first cohort, finished this last June. And one of the things that I love about the cohort is that, of course, I love and respect each of them, but that we have 2 elders that were a part of that cohort, and they graduated with their doctoral degrees. So all of these women are going to go back and really have monumental impacts on their families, whether they're the first doctors or just continuing all of the amazing work that they're already doing. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as a way that we can leave the legacy, right? I might be the first in my family, but I'm not going to be the last. And I might be the first in some of my areas, but I'm not going to be the last. And it's my responsibility to create opportunities for more to come behind me, just like for you, maybe in your respective areas and what you're doing as well. So I have some questions for us to think about. What are we? So thinking about who you are in your organization, in your community, in your family. What are the collective values that you all bring with you? What are you building? And then what are you healing from? All of us are healing, right? All of us are not impacted by historical trauma, right? I think about my grandma, who I mentioned earlier. She grew up in boarding school from the age of 5 through high school. She only went to public school for 2 years of her whole education. But somehow, despite growing up in a boarding school, she was still able to love. And that's why, to me, she's so powerful. Because we know people who have gone to boarding school who have a hard time showing emotion, have a hard time saying I love you, have a hard time connecting. And somehow my grandmother was still able to do that, and that's why she's powerful. And so thinking about and identifying that and then taking steps toward that. And then how do we, who are we this with? Who is it for? And then what is our vision? And this can be on an individual level, and it can be at a community level, right? Today, you are all a community together. One of the things that I do in my classes is every student in my class, when I start a class, we start off with identifying a value that's important in a community, and we build a community in the classroom so that over the course of the semester or quarter, we're all responsible for each other as a community. And those values, if we fall outside of those values, we can remind ourselves of those values because we're functioning as a community. And so thinking about you all, you're a community today, right? So if you see a little child that might need help, and you can help them, right? If you see an elder who needs help to be taken care of, you can help them. Those are the things that we bring into our daily practices. And then what is holding us back? So what is holding us back in naming our trickster? Right? So many of our tribes have tricksters in our tribes, right? And so I have a trickster in my tribe, or actually all of my tribes, but the tricksters in our tribes, they gave us a hard time, but they also taught us lessons, right? And so thinking about that for us, like what is holding us back? Whether it's ourselves, whether it's a part of our lives or something that's going on, identifying that and learning the lesson from why it's holding you back, but then also like figure out a way to move around that or to learn from it. So how do we ignite our fire for 7 generations? So I don't know, how many of you have watched Reservation Dogs? Good. How's it going? Good. This scene, anytime I watch this scene, I cry. And I have watched it a few times. For those of you who are not familiar, I'll just recap for you. At this part, Willie Jack, who's the one in the middle, I went to see her Aunt Hockty in prison because she can connect with spirits. She's a wise person for her that she consults with. And so Willie Jack was struggling because her friends are not all getting along as they were before. And so she asked Hockty, like, what does she do? What does she need to do? And she asked for advice. And Hockty tells her to close her eyes and to pray. And then Hockty, because she has this connection, was able to bring the ancestors back. And she reminds Willie Jack that, remember those that were behind you, coming behind you, that are always with you, right? She didn't need Hockty. She just needed to be reminded that her ancestors are with her. And so this moment, at the end, when she really can hear the singing, you can hear the creek singing, and then at the end she feels the ancestor touch her on the shoulder to really acknowledge that they're with her. And so I think about this moment a lot, because I think about how do we feel our ancestors with us in these types of moments? How do we pray? How do we connect ourselves? And then how do we take our next steps in our commitments? How do we ensure our youth know their ancestors are with them and carry them through it all? How do we help our youth and our families see themselves as our hope for today and the future? And then sometimes even as adults, we need to remind ourselves, right, when we're going through those hard times and those moments, that we're not by ourselves, that we have people that were standing behind us and with us through those moments of trials and barriers that we might be facing. So I'm going to close the circle and close us out for today. So one of the things I took this quote from house school. Anybody who's gone to Lawrence, Kansas and has been to house school, this is on their football stadium, a quote with a warrior that says, "Have you made your ancestors proud today?" And so I remind this, and I take this with me, because this is again one of my ancestors, Chief Joseph Himelaka. Have you made your ancestors proud today? And so thinking about, we're not going to do it every day, right? But every day we can try to make our ancestors proud. We're going to have days where we're not good, but we're going to also have days where we're going to really be doing that work that's going to have an impact. Whether it's small and we can't see it, it will come to fruition later on. And so I'd just like to say aho and katseyo for being here, and I hope somehow this was helpful for you. I also invite you to go to the back before you leave. You want to make a little medicine bundle filled with cedar that was picked in the Wichita Mountains by Elk Mountain. So you're welcome to take that with you to remind you of your medicine and who you are. And I hope that you all enjoy yourselves today, and I'm sure your stomachs are talking with you right now as well. So, aho and katseyo. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's copies of the presentation back there.